Konnichiwa, all you gearheads. It's time for another episode of F1 Brake Check. On today's episode, we will recount the history of the Japanese Grand Prix. I will monologue on part one of our Tech Corner series about F1 engines. Corey will stir up my ahi tuna tower of a brain with a new trivia question in our Stump the Pundit section. And we'll have a full breakdown of the action from Suzuka. Stick around. F1 Brake Check is grabbing the bento box, chugging the saki, and dropping the hammer.
Welcome. You are listening to F1 Brake Check, the epic podcast for all things Formula One, where we discuss technology, history, news, and perspective. With your hosts, Scott Vick and Corey Broom.
Okay, we're back with F1 Brake Check. I'm Scott Vick, your host. Along with me is my co-host, my partner in crime, my brother in arms, Corey Broom. Corey, how you doing this week, sir?
This week, good. It's only Monday.
Yeah, that's true. It's very early in the week.
Yeah, very good. We just went through the eclipse, which was kind of cool. We had the total eclipse here in Texas, so it was really nice.
Yeah, it was very, very, very cool.
3 minutes and then back to normal, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about you, but for those 3 minutes, I'd gone outside and had my eclipse glasses and everything, was checking it out, and then was able to take them off and watch the total eclipse, which was very cool. But it was also very cool that the street lights came on. I could actually see a star in the sky. It was really kind of wild.
Yeah. It was.
So we had a barn burner of a race this weekend, which, I mean, other than the somewhat predictable outcome, I thought it was pretty good. How about you?
I loved it. You pretty much could predict the first few spots. So, just like what we said during the preview was Max had something to prove. He was not going to take anything other than first, which, obviously he did. So we'll talk more about that in the news, but yeah, it's a fantastic race.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so let's talk about the history of the Japanese Grand Prix. With majestic Mount Fuji as the backdrop, the Fuji Speedway hosted the first Formula One Grand Prix in 1976. Although the race only stayed on the calendar for 2 years, 1976 and 1977, those 2 years saw the exciting title deciding race between James Hunt and Niki Lauda in monsoon conditions and the second win of Mario Andretti's career. After a decade absence from the F1 calendar, the Japanese Grand Prix returned to the calendar in 1987 at the Suzuka circuit. The Suzuka circuit is loved by the drivers and notable for its postcard perfect backdrops and for being the only figure eight style track on the F1 calendar. After heavy redevelopment of the Fuji circuit by owner Toyota, F1 announced that the Fuji circuit would be used for the 2007 and 2008 races, and that it would alternate with Suzuka starting in 2009. However, with the global recession of 2008 putting massive economic pressure on car manufacturers, Toyota announced that the Grand Prix would not return to Fuji in 2010 and beyond. With the return to Suzuka in 2010, it was announced that Suzuka would have exclusive rights to host the Japanese Grand Prix, and after multiple contract extensions, will continue to do so until 2029. With the 2024 edition, the race moves from its traditional end-of-season location on the calendar to being the fourth race of the 24-race season. Because of its traditional late date on the calendar, the Japanese Grand Prix saw 13 drivers' titles decided on its hallowed tarmac. It has witnessed such title deciders between the aforementioned Hunt Lauda, as well as between Prost Senna, Mansell Piquet, and Hill Schumacher, to name just a few. Although attendance levels have not risen to the level that they were in the early 90s, in part due to the COVID pandemic and Japan's prolonged economic slump, the race will continue to be a driver and fan favorite for many years to come. Anything you want to talk about that?
It's one of the circuits that I desperately want to get to. Japan's always been on my list of places to visit, and I would love to watch this circuit. Just the energy there, you can just see on the TV that how great of an energy everybody has. It looks amazing to me. So that one, there's a few more that are on my list that I really want to go see.
I agree with you. Japan is definitely one of those ones that I would love to get to someday. Like you said, just the atmosphere alone. I mean, the fans there, although they're very, and they even made a comment about it during the Sky telecast on Sunday, that even though the Japanese fans are by and large very reserved, they don't make a ton of noise and things like that, but they are very enthusiastic. The costumes that they all wear, and the signs that they make and things like that they bring to the track are just amazing. They're just incredible. And just to be there for the sights and the sounds of it all and everything, And I love the fact that now that it's moved to the springtime in Japan, it's like we got the blossoming of the cherry blossom trees, the beauty of
Yeah.
the circuit and everything. That, yes, it's up there as one of the top places I would love to get to someday.
Yep. Same here.
All right, so let's move on to our tech corner. So this week we're going to take and start a multi-part section because one of the most complicated parts of an F1 car has to be the engine. And so we're going to take and do a deep dive into the current power units, as well as some of the major innovations and evolutions referred to as power units simply because of the way that the engines are made up. This week in part one, we're going to dive into the engine rules and a couple of the major innovations that came about during the early years of Formula One. Next week, we will dive into the later part of the history of engines in F1, as well as more into the major innovations and revolutions that were made in engines in Formula One. And in part three, we'll dive even deeper into the current power units, how they're made up, how they work, how the teams deploy them and evaluate them and get the absolute maximum performance out of them. Even most casual fans know that the current power unit regulations for Formula One, no longer referred to as engines because of their hybrid nature, the power units consist of a 1.6 liter turbocharged V6 internal combustion engine mated to two different energy recovery systems, electrical motors, and rechargeable batteries. The current sporting regulations span 69 pages of rules and definitions that govern every aspect of the modern power units. However, in the history of F1, the engine rules and the restrictions have gone through numerous iterations spanning minor tweaks to sweeping changes. In 1950, the first Formula One World Championship regulations governing the engines in competition were very simple: 4.5 liters for naturally aspirated engines and 1.5 liters for engines that utilize superchargers. There were no rules governing the number of cylinders, engine architecture, i.e., V configuration versus inline versus any other kind of layout. Crankshafts, camshafts, fuel and air delivery, etc., were all open to interpretation. This led to a wide range of engine types like the BRM V16, the Ferrari V12, the Alfa Romeo Inline 8, and a myriad of other configurations. Additionally, the rules flexibility allowed both major manufacturers and privateers to compete on relatively equal footing, and a number of the cars manufacturers were able to produce both their own engine and chassis. The first change in the regulations came in 1954 when the size of the engines were reduced to 2.5 liters for normally aspirated engines and 750 cc's for supercharged engines. With the latest regulations, Mercedes were the first to compete with direct fuel injection on their inline 8-cylinder. During this era, the car still had no restrictions on their configuration or even the placement in the car. This latter leading to one of the single biggest revolutions in the history of motorsport when Bugatti, in their one and only F1 appearance in 1956, showed up with a car that had the engine mounted in the rear. Up until this point, all F1 cars competed with their engine in the front of the driver, exactly like their road-going brethren. Cooper, the next year, would produce a car that followed the Bugatti lead, and by 1960, all cars would have the engine mounted behind the driver. Famously, Ferrari would be one of the last competitors to make the switch to a rear engine configuration. Enzo Ferrari famously resisted the idea of rear engine cars, saying, "The horse should always pull the cart, never push it." 1961 saw the next evolution of the engine rules changed when the capacity was reduced to 1.5 liters and supercharging was banned. Appropriately, the horsepower numbers dropped significantly to approximately 150 brake horsepower, but as is the nature of F1 and the engineers who propel the sport forward, horsepower eventually crept up to around 250 brake horsepower. The notion of supercharged engines reappeared with the next change in the rule in 1966. The new rules allowed for a 3-liter naturally aspirated engine and 1.5 liters for forced induction. And, as always, there were 0 configuration limitations. This led engineers and designers to try some revolutionary ideas, but also some truly bizarre ideas, such as the BRM H16. Essentially, BRM took their existing 1.5-liter flat 8, meaning that the two banks of cylinders were flat instead of in a V shape, and mated it on top of another flat 8. The design proved to be very heavy and unreliable due to its complicated gearing and the need for each half of the engine to have its own radiators, fuel pumps, water pumps, and distributor. A true revolution in engineering was unleashed on the world in 1976 when the English manufacturer Cosworth introduced the Ford Cosworth DFV. The Monster V8 was an evolution of the Ford Cosworth FVA, an inline four that was one of the first engines to feature 4 valves per cylinder. The mighty DFV would go on to propel the likes of Lotus, Mantra, Tyrrell, McLaren, Williams, and Benetton to constructors and drivers' championships for decades. The next revolution would come a decade later when in 1986, Renault would introduce the turbocharged Renault EF1. Although the engine was an unmitigated disaster because of its unreliability, often exceedingly fast, the car engine was also prone to spectacular detonations. The car would lead many F1 qualifying and races, but more often than not would fail in spectacular fashion during the actual race. However, with the introduction of the Renault, turbocharging was here to stay. Ferrari would quickly take a page from Renault and introduce its own turbocharged engine, and the rest of the field would soon follow. Honda would be the manufacturer who saw the greatest success with turbocharging, though, first powering Williams to championships and later, more famously, McLaren. 1988 would see the sunset on the turbocharger era, with many of the turbocharged engines exceeding 1,000 horsepower by the time they were banned. This wraps up part 1 of our dive into the history and technology of F1 engines. Come back next week as we dive into part 2. Corey, your thoughts on these early eras of Formula One engines?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think I've been a fan of F1 8 or 9 years now. So a lot of this history, I never really paid attention to. And really, it's real fascinating just seeing the evolution of where we started from with engines and now going to power units. And I thought it was really good that you went through what the variances are, why in F1 we call them power units and why we don't call them engines anymore. It's really fascinating just to see in the trial and error, basically, right? What they went through, what they tried. Hey, this sounds good on paper, but it really doesn't work well in practice. Hey, if you don't fail, you don't learn.
And that's one of the things that's, like you said, that's really cool about F1, though, is that unlike now, where the power units are so heavily regulated, the energy recovery systems, and we'll get into a lot more of these in a later installment of the Tech Corner, but just at a high level, I mean, all of the energy recovery systems are homologated, which means that every team runs the exact same energy recovery systems. Now they have more leeway as far as like batteries, battery placement. All right, fans. So now it is time for Corey to scramble up my pea-sized brain of an ahi tuna tower and our segment that we call Stump the Pundit. So, Corey, what do you have for me today?
All right, just a few questions today. Actually, one, in doing some research, I didn't realize this, but who was the first woman to score points in F1?
I should know this, but I do not. I know that there's been a handful. I know the last woman to participate in a Formula One event was the incomparable Susie Wolf, who participated for Williams in a practice session, but I don't know who was the last woman to score points. You'll have to
score
so
points,
go ahead and
though,
enlighten
yeah.
me.
Lella Lombardi. She was the first one to score points in F1. So who's the only driver to win a championship that he built himself of his own construction?
That would be Bruce McLaren.
Jack Brabham.
Yeah, you're right. It is Brabham.
Who's the only driver to have won a Formula One Grand Prix and a car bearing his own name?
Bruce McLaren.
That's him, yeah. And that's it.
All right. So, listeners, tell us what you think. Tell us your thoughts on the Tech Corner, the history of the Japanese Grand Prix, or any of the trivia questions that Corey presented during the Stump the Pundits. So, shall we move on to our recap for this weekend?
Sounds good.
Last weekend was the Japanese Grand Prix 2024 edition. And the first thing that we have to take and talk about is the track temps, how they threw everything into chaos and led to some very interesting tire strategies. This weekend, as we talked about during the history at the top of the show, traditionally, the Japanese Grand Prix has always been in the very late fall and has always been one of the last races of the season. And this year, it has moved from its traditional spot at the end of the season to the fourth race of the season right after Melbourne. So the weather was quite a bit different to what the teams were used to for running at Suzuka. They're used to running in the much cooler temperatures in the fall, and it was much, much warmer this year. And you combine that with the super abrasive surface of the Suzuka track, and it led to some really, really interesting tire strategy that played out over the course of the race. So, Corey, your thoughts?
It was amazing to me. Your tire strategy in this race either gave you 3 or 4 places or more, or it got you out of the points, as you
Yes.
saw in several cases.
We saw some really, really interesting stuff. We saw drivers like Fernando Alonso that
Yeah.
started on the soft tires, hoping to make up some places at the start. We had other drivers who were switching up tires at times that we wouldn't traditionally see them doing. It led to a really, really interesting race and some really, really interesting results. Tire strategy aside, the first lap chaos has to be discussed. So before we even got through turn 3, Alex Albon was taken out of the race by Daniel Ricciardo. Now, when I say he was taken out, it's only because Daniel Ricciardo was the cause. Like the commentators were talking about on the Sky Sports telecast, it was just simply a racing accident. It was, if you look on the replay, Ricardo was basically getting squeezed by Stroll on one side, Albon on the other. He was looking over at Albon going into the corner because the turn 3 corner goes to the left. He's getting squeezed on one side by Stroll. Albon's on the other side. Because turn 3 turns to the left, Danny Rick's staring at Stroll, trying to avoid him going into the corner. He drifts to the right, never sees Albon, clips Albon, sends them both into the tire barrier. How much damage was done to that Williams? And are the poor mechanics back at Grove having to repair another car, trying to turn it around as quickly as possible? Not to mention the fact that they had a couple of upgrades that they had done to the car for the front wings and basically had to toss the whole thing in the bin. So the first lap chaos brings out the red flag. So we don't even get a full lap in. So the drivers are brought into the pit. And because of the way that the red flag rules are written, they basically get a free pit stop. So at that point, they can change tires. They can change anything on the car that they want. Almost all of the front runners took advantage of that. Alonso swapped out his soft tires for mediums.
Yep.
The next restart, for all intents and purposes, was much more sedate, no more incidents. Okay, so after the restart, we then had a very, very good race with the exception of the top spot, which even Max had to do a little bit of work to get his victory, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But for all intents and purposes, Red Bull came back with a vengeance this weekend after their horrible showing at Melbourne. So, first of all, your thoughts on Red Bull's dominant 1-2?
Max got first place, 25 points plus fastest lap, 26 points in total. Checo got the points right after that. So they got as much points as possible. We talked about this on the last podcast where there's no doubt that Red Bull was going to come back and they were going to come back hard. And Checo ran a fantastic race, but he could not close the gap under 8 seconds from Max.
Yeah.
And he was leading Ferrari by far.
Yes.
I was really surprised at how Ferrari showed. I really expected them to challenge a lot more to Red Bull because they have been closing that gap, but here at Suzuka, they've kind of fell back a little bit. They didn't have the pace that Red Bull had.
Yeah, but I think a lot of that came down to the higher temperatures and the tire degradation, because even Sainz says during the post-race interview when he was talking to Mark Webber, even he said that once the clouds came in and the track temperature started dropping and everything, the degradation started to go away and the car seemed to just come alive and seemed to do much, much better. By all intents and purposes, it still wasn't a bad showing because Sainz came in. He was only 20 seconds behind Max.
Right.
It's not like some of the races we saw last year where Max was 40,
30
50
seconds.
seconds
Yeah.
ahead of second place, let alone,
Right.
the top 3 spots were still all covered by 20 seconds, which is still not a bad result for Ferrari. So they split their tire strategy with
Yeah.
Sainz doing 2 stops and Leclerc only doing 1 stop. And Leclerc didn't have the greatest qualified, I think, 7th or 8th. And to be able to take and come home in 4th place just goes to show you that we've lamented on several times already this year about what a night and day difference the Ferrari strategy has been this season. Even though they weren't able to challenge Red Bull as much as I think that they would have liked to, and kind of the rest of us thought that they might have been able to still bring it home in 3rd and 4th and gaining maximum points for
Yeah.
what was on offer for this weekend. This is not the Ferrari of old. This is definitely Fred Vasseur's Ferrari, and it is a sight to behold.
And with that being said, your next question about signs.
How is Sainz not already signed by somebody?
What are you waiting for? Somebody's going to scoop him up. They have to. Like we said before, I would love him to be in that Mercedes seat. If Vettel says no, I would love to see him there. But you're exactly right. How is he not signed already? It makes no sense at all. Unless he's in contract negotiations now.
I guarantee you he is already in negotiations with at least one team, if not a couple others. If Vettel isn't an option, he's not going to want to wait too long and let Sainz slip through his hands.
Right.
I guarantee you by late May, early June is going to be getting really, really crazy. At the very least, the rumor mill alone is just going to be nuts.
Yeah.
On the flip side of Red Bull and Ferrari, McLaren, they started off the weekend really, really strong. Their simulations in FP1, they looked like they were going to really benefit at this track. But for some reason, the tires just did not want to cooperate with the McLaren this time around. Although they had a really strong practice, they qualified very, very well. They really faded during the race.
Right.
Your thoughts?
We saw this behavior last year where they started out horribly, and then towards the end of the year, they fixed several issues and they became really close to Red Bull. So I'm hoping that they can fix whatever issues that they have now and return back to form, because they're one of the teams that I was really looking forward to being up there challenging Red Bull.
Yes. At times they looked like legitimate challengers. I mean, Norris's qualifying pace, he was on it. I mean, he was only 2.5 tenths off of Max's qualifying time. So in qualifying trim, they looked really, really good. It was just in race trim that this particular time, car let him down. For him to still come home in 5th place, let's be honest with you, Leclerc's pass on Lando was just it was I mean, there was a lot of passes this weekend that were just incredible.
Right.
And it was just something that Lando just had no answer for. In the end, it was an okay weekend for McLaren, but I think that in 2 weeks when we get to China, at least what I'm hoping it's going to be a different story. This was another Jekyll and Hyde weekend for Mercedes. After the washed out FP2, Lewis said that the car was much more in the sweet spot. He was much happier with the car. It looked like they were going to have a much better weekend. And then come qualifying, they were off in no man's land. I mean, it was like Lewis had his worst qualifying at Suzuka since his McLaren days, which was very uncharacteristic. George didn't have a great qualifying either, and he was further back. Poor Lewis had to struggle to come home in 9th.
And now talking about Yuki.
So on the flip side, Yuki, he has found another gear, and I am so excited to see this. For the 4th week in a row, he outqualified his much more highly touted teammate, as we've talked about a number of times. He makes it into Q3. And then, even though despite the fact that he had a really bad start and dropped back into the pack and was right there in the thick of things, he never set a foot wrong. He actually made some passes in during the race that took your breath away because they were so spectacular. Was the first Japanese driver to score points on his home Grand Prix since Kobayashi 2012. So I've become a Yuki fan. I really have.
Well, I mean, not only that, but also think about, he has attributed all of the points.
Yes.
Danny
Yes,
has
exactly.
a big goose egg.
Yes, exactly. Ricardo did have a really good weekend going. I mean, he just barely missed out on Q3,
Yeah.
basically got knocked out by his own teammate
Did.
and lined
Yeah.
up one spot behind him. So he looked much better, but then it all unraveled on the very first lap. His best finish for the year still hasn't even been in the top 10, where Yuki has been consistently in the points. So, talking about another driver who had a mostly solid performance
Yep.
this weekend was Logan Sargent. He did very, very well during the race by his standards. At one point, he was running as high as 12th. I think he's definitely heading in the right direction.
No doubt
Your
about
thought?
it. Yeah, even after his gravel trap mishap, a little bit on the embarrassing side from a driver's perspective. I was watching during the race how far he was back from the Alpines, and every lap he was gaining significantly on them. So it wasn't like he was dropping back like what we saw last year, where he would keep dropping back and back and back in the pack. He was actually gaining on the Alpines. To me, that's a really good sign that he's getting his confidence there, that he's able to make mistakes and then come back. It'll be good to see him in the next few races to see how much better. Because, like you said, he was as high as 12th, and he was really knocking on the door of 11th place. It'd be great to see, if he doesn't make any more mistakes, what he can do in 2 weeks in China.
Yeah, absolutely. So, going from a mostly solid performance to just an absolutely miserable performance, we have to talk real quick about Sauber and Alpine. Sauber, it was just another weekend where it's like Joe, they ended up having to retire his car because of a gearbox problem.
Right.
Bottas, he qualified fairly well, but ended up dropping back in the pack. They just had another series of just absolutely miserable pit stops. Miserable being a relative term. By Sauber standards, they were much, much better. By the rest of the F1 field, they were pretty awful. Instead of being 40, 50 seconds now, the pit stops were in the 6 to 8 second range. When you compare it to Red Bull's fastest pit stop, which was just a little over 2 seconds, that's still, it might as well have been a year.
Yeah, you've lost the race by that point.
All right, well, let's go ahead and bring this home. So the clock has reached its time limit, and we have to throw the checkered flag. Join us next week when we will preview the return of the Chinese Grand Prix. We'll take a look at the latest news and rumors. We'll once again play Stump the Pundit, and we'll have part 2 of our Tech Corner discussing the evolution of F1 engines. So until next time, he's Corey, I'm Scott. We're the pundits of F1 Brake Check. Let's go!
Thank you for listening to F1 Brake Check. If you have enjoyed what you heard, don't miss a single episode by hitting that subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher, or you can watch the video version on YouTube. Help us grow by sharing us with your friends and fellow F1 fans. You can contact us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok and X at F1 Brake Check. Our website is f1brakecheck.com, where you will find links to all our content. We value your passion and your feedback, so please take a moment to review our podcast. Your reviews help us grow and improve, and it means the world to us. Share your thoughts, rate us, and let us know how we can make the show experience even better. F1 Brake Check is a production of Brake Check Media. For your hosts Scott Vick and Corey Broom, until next time, keep yourself inside track limits, and try not to pitch it in the kitty litter.